Hey everyone. We all think we know the Middle Ages, but the way they handled crime was actually insane. Today, if you break the law, you might pay a fine or go to jail. Back then, they didn't really have prisons, so they got creative with your body instead. We're talking about things like pigs getting their own lawyers in court, or metal masks being locked onto people's faces for gossiping. They even dug up a dead pope just to make him stand trial. I'm just a guy who likes reading about history, so subscribe if you want to hang around for more stories. Also, do me a favor and drop a comment to tell me where you're listening from tonight. Now, let's look at what actually happened. So, to understand why things got so weird, you have to realize that the world back then worked totally differently than ours. Today, if someone breaks into your house, you call the police. A squad car shows up, they take a report, and maybe a detective follows up. But in a medieval village, there was no 911. There were no sirens. There wasn't even a local police station. If a crime happened, it was on you and your neighbors to catch the person. You were the first responders, the jury, and sometimes the muscle. If you didn't handle it yourself, it didn't get handled. And here is the big thing. They didn't really have a prison system. Think about how much money we spend today on huge concrete buildings, guards, and 3 meals a day for inmates. In the Middle Ages, they didn't have that kind of budget. They didn't want to pay to keep you in a cell. They didn't want to feed you while you sat around doing nothing. If you were a criminal, you were a drain on the town's resources. They didn't see the point in losing more money just to keep you locked away. So they needed a way to punish you that was fast, cheap, and extremely effective. Their solution was simple: shame. They turned your own neighbors into your jailers. If you messed up, they didn't want to hide you away in a dark room. They wanted you right out in the sun where everyone could see you. It was all about public embarrassment. They figured if they could make you feel like the biggest loser in the county, you'd think twice before doing it again. Plus, it warned everyone else what happens when you break the rules. It was a visual lesson for the whole crowd. This is why the town square became the center of the justice system. It wasn't just a place to buy eggs or wool. It was a stage. If you got caught selling watered-down ale or stealing a pair of boots, you weren't going to a quiet court hearing. You were headed for the stocks. That's just a couple of heavy wooden planks with holes for your head and hands. It's a simple design. It's cheap to build and requires almost zero maintenance. But once you're locked in, you realize the true cost. You're stuck there for hours or maybe even a couple of days. You can't swat a fly off your nose. You can't wipe your face. And the whole time, people are walking by. They're pointing. They're making jokes. Kids might throw mud or rotten fruit at you. It was a social death sentence. By the time they finally let you out, your reputation was trashed. Everyone in town knew your face and exactly what you did. That was the whole idea. It was cheap, it was public, and it stayed with you long after the wooden boards were opened. But public shame was just the start. To really understand why these punishments were so brutal, you have to realize that back then, the law and the church were basically the same thing. There was no line between what was illegal and what was a sin. If you broke a rule, you weren't just a criminal, you were a sinner. And that meant the stakes were way higher than just a night in a jail cell. Everyone back then believed in a place called purgatory. Think of it like a waiting room for heaven, but with a lot more fire. They thought that if you committed a crime, you had to pay for it with physical pain. If you didn't pay for it while you were alive, you'd pay for it 10 times worse after you died. So, in a weird way, getting whipped or branded was seen as a favor. The logic was simple. A little pain now saves you from an eternity of agony later. The man who called the shots was the local lord. He ran the show. He was the judge and the jury. But he didn't do the actual hitting or hanging himself. He hired an executioner for that. You'd think the guy doing the holy work of cleaning souls would be a celebrity, right? Not even close. The executioner was a total outcast. He was the guy nobody wanted to sit next to. He usually had to live in a house outside the town gates because people thought he was cursed. He couldn't go to the local pub. He couldn't even touch bread in a shop. He had to point at what he wanted with a stick so he wouldn't get his germs on the food. He was necessary, but he was treated like a monster. He lived in the shadows so the rest of society could keep their hands clean. But there was one more rule to this game, and it's the oldest rule in the book. Money talks. The system was totally rigged. If you were a nobleman or a rich merchant, you rarely saw a whip or a branding iron. You'd just pay a big fine and walk away. Your bank account protected your skin. But if you were a peasant, you didn't have any gold. All you had was your own body. Since you couldn't pay in coins, you paid in blood. While the rich guy was back at his table eating dinner, the poor guy was at the town square getting his back ripped open. In the eyes of the law, the rich paid for their sins with their purses, while the poor paid with their lives. It was a brutal system, and your survival depended entirely on how much you could afford to lose. But what if you didn't commit a massive crime? What if you weren't out there robbing people or starting fights? What if you were just a guy who loved the local pub a little too much? In the eyes of the law back then, being a common drunk was a serious problem. But they had a very specific, very weird way of handling you. They didn't want to lock you in a dark cell where no one could see you. They didn't want your money, because you probably didn't have any. They wanted your pride. This is where the drunkard's cloak comes in. It was also known as the Newcastle cloak. Now, when you hear the word cloak, you probably think of a nice piece of clothing, maybe something made of wool to keep you warm on a rainy night. But this wasn't something you'd ever want to wear. It was actually just a giant, heavy wooden beer barrel. The town officials would take one of these shipping barrels and turn it into a suit of armor for people who couldn't handle their liquor. They would flip it over and saw a hole in the bottom just big enough for a human head to squeeze through. Then they'd cut 2 smaller holes on the sides. Those were for your arms. They didn't bother sanding down the wood or making it comfortable. It was rough, heavy, and usually smelled like old sour beer and damp basement. So picture this. You've had a few too many drinks. You're stumbling through the streets, singing too loud, and making a general nuisance of yourself. The town watch picks you up. They don't give you a fine or tell you to go home and sleep it off. They drag you to the center of town and bring out the barrel. They lift that massive thing up high and drop it right over your shoulders. Your head pops out the top like a turtle. Your arms are shoved through the side holes. You can't pull them back in, and you can't reach your face. You're just stuck. The weight of the wood starts digging into your collarbones immediately. Every time you try to take a step, the bottom of the barrel bangs against your shins and knees. You can't sit down. You can't even stand up straight because the thing is so clunky. But the officials aren't done yet. This isn't just a stand-in-the-corner kind of punishment. They force you to walk. They lead you out into the middle of the main street right when the market is the busiest. You have to march up and down the road for everyone to see. Imagine that walk. It's loud. Every step you take makes a hollow thumping sound that echoes off the buildings.
You're stumbling and swaying because the barrel throws off your balance. If you trip and fall, you're in real trouble. You'd be rolling around on the ground like a bug on its back, unable to use your hands to push yourself up. You'd have to wait for a guard to come over and haul you back onto your feet while the crowd roars with laughter. And that crowd is the real sting. People in these towns didn't have much to do for fun, so when someone got put in the Newcastle cloak, it was the biggest show in town. Your neighbors, the people you see every single day would line the sides of the street. They wouldn't just watch you go by either. They'd get involved.
They would reach down into the gutters and grab whatever they could find. We're talking mud, horse manure, and rotten scraps of food from the market stalls. Since your arms are pinned, you can't block anything. You just have to walk there and take it while a rotten tomato explodes on your forehead or a clump of dirt gets stuck in your ear. You're a walking, human-sized target. You can't wipe your eyes. You can't brush the filth off your clothes. You just have to keep moving while the whole town points and mocks you. This would go on for hours. You'd be paraded back and forth until the sun started to go down. By the time they finally lifted that barrel off you, you were exhausted, sore, and covered in trash. But here's the thing. It didn't actually hurt you. Not physically, anyway. You didn't have any broken bones or lasting scars. You were still in one piece. The real damage was to your life in that town. See, back then, your reputation was your bank account. If people didn't respect you, you were finished. After a day in the Newcastle cloak, you weren't just the guy who got drunk once. You were the barrel guy. Every time you walked into a shop or tried to find a job, people remembered seeing you covered in garbage, stumbling down the street in a beer crate. It was a social death sentence. It turned you into a permanent joke, and in a small medieval town, that was a lot harder to survive than a simple fine. But if you thought sitting in a beer crate was bad, things were about to get a whole lot heavier. Being a joke was one thing, but what if the town didn't just want to laugh at you? What if they wanted to shut you up? Literally. If you were a woman in a medieval town and you had what they called a sharp tongue, you were in some serious trouble. Maybe you got into a shouting match with the guy selling fish. Maybe you told your neighbor exactly what you thought of her family. Or maybe you just dared to complain about your husband being a lazy drunk. To the men running the show, this wasn't just a loud conversation, it was a crime. And they had a very specific, very heavy piece of equipment ready for you. It was called the Scold's Bridle, or the Branks. Here's how it worked. Imagine an iron cage. It's not a full helmet, more like a skeleton of a mask. It's made of thick, cold iron bars that wrap around your skull. Now, think about how you'd put that on. The blacksmith or the town constable wouldn't be gentle about it. They'd pull the cage over your head, and then they'd move to the back. There was a hinge and a lock. You'd hear that heavy iron clink right against your ear as they snapped it shut. But the worst part wasn't the weight on your head. The real nightmare was inside the mask. Just like a bit you'd put in a horse's mouth, this was a flat plate of iron that went straight between your teeth. It sat right on top of your tongue. You couldn't spit it out. You couldn't move it. If you tried to talk, that metal plate would press down hard. Some of these plates even had little spikes or serrated edges. If you tried to form a word or yell for help, those spikes would dig into your tongue. You didn't just stay quiet because the law told you to. You stayed quiet because it physically hurt to make a single sound. Once you were locked in and you had tasted that cold, rusty iron, the real show started.
They didn't just leave you in a cell to think about what you did. They wanted everyone to see you. They'd attach a long iron chain to a ring on the top of the cage. And this is the part that really gets me. They didn't always have a guard lead you through the streets. Often, they handed that chain to your husband. I want you to really picture that for a second. It's market day. The town is packed. There's the smell of mud and livestock and wood smoke. Your husband is walking through the center of the square, holding a leash, and at the end of that leash is you. Your head is trapped in this iron frame. You can't swallow your own spit properly because of the plate in your mouth, so you're drooling down your chin. The cage is heavy, so your neck is screaming, and you're forced to look at the ground. Your husband is leading you past your friends, your family, and the people you've known your whole life. He's doing this because if he doesn't, he might get fined or lose his standing in the town. He has to prove he can manage you. It took a private argument, something that should have stayed in your own kitchen, and turned it into public entertainment. People didn't just stand back and watch, either. They'd follow the parade. They'd point and laugh. Some people might throw rotten vegetables or horse manure at you. They'd mock your husband for needing a cage to keep you quiet. It was a carnival of shame. You were being treated like a dangerous animal, all because you had an opinion or lost your temper. Eventually, after you'd been dragged through every street in town and made sure everyone had a chance to get a good look, they'd lead you back home or to the town square. They'd unlock the cage, and the iron would finally come off, but the damage was done. Your jaw would be aching. Your tongue might be bleeding, but the real sting was the silence. When you went back to your house, you knew that the bridle was still there, hanging on a hook in the town hall. You knew that every person you passed for the rest of your life had seen you on that leash. It wasn't just about stopping one argument. It was about making sure you never felt safe enough to speak up again. It turned the simple act of talking into a gamble. And in a world where the iron mask was always waiting, most people decided it just wasn't worth the risk. But you didn't just have to worry about what came out of your own mouth. In the Middle Ages, the law wasn't just for people. It was for everyone and everything. Imagine you're walking through a town square in the late 1300s. You see a crowd gathering, a judge sitting on a high bench, and a lawyer shouting about justice. You look over at the person on trial, but it isn't a person at all. It's a pig. I know that sounds like a joke, but back then it was deadly serious. People truly believed that animals knew exactly what they were doing. They thought a cow, a dog, or even a swarm of bugs could commit a crime on purpose. If an animal broke the law, it didn't just get a kick in the ribs, it got a day in court. Let's talk about what happened in a place called Falaise, France, in the year 1386. This is probably the most famous case on the books. There was this pig wandering the streets, and it ended up attacking a small child. It was a nasty situation, and the kid didn't make it. In our world today, the authorities would just put the animal down and move on. But these people didn't do that. They went out and formally arrested the pig. They treated it like a common criminal. They didn't lock it in a stable or a wooden cage. They took it to the local prison and locked it in a cell with human inmates. I want you to really picture that for a second. You're in a dark, smelly dungeon for stealing some bread, and the guards open the door and shove a 300-pound sow in there with you. You're sharing your straw bed with a murderer who happens to have hooves. The pig stayed in that jail cell for 9 days while the town got ready for the trial. And this wasn't some quick meeting behind closed doors. They went all out. They hired a defense lawyer for the pig. Someone had to stand up in front of the judge and argue that the pig wasn't responsible for its actions. They had a prosecutor, too. They called witnesses to describe what they saw in the street. The whole town showed up to watch. They sat there and listened to hours of legal arguments about a farm animal. The judge took his time, weighed the evidence, and eventually delivered a written verdict. He found the pig guilty of murder. But the weirdest part was the execution. They didn't just take the pig out back and end it. They wanted to make a statement. They wanted the punishment to fit the crime. And since the crime was human, the punishment had to look human too. On the day of the hanging, they brought the pig out to the town square. But first, they dressed it up. They put a pair of human clothes on it, a little jacket and some pants. They even managed to get a pair of white gloves onto its front feet. They wanted it to look like a man as it walked to the gallows. They led the pig up the wooden steps. A priest was there to say a few words. Then they put a noose around its neck and hanged it until it was dead. They didn't stop there, though. They left the body hanging there for everyone to see, just like they would with a human thief. They even made the pig's owner pay for the whole thing. He had to pay for the pig's food while it was in jail, and he had to pay the executioner's fee. It was a massive, expensive production just to kill a farm animal. This happened all the time. It wasn't just one crazy town in France. There are records of dozens of trials like this across Europe. Sometimes it was a single animal, and sometimes it was an entire species. Take the rats of Autun. A group of rats was accused of destroying the local barley crop. The local priest actually stood up in church and formally summoned the rats to appear in court. When the rats didn't show up for their trial, their lawyer had a brilliant excuse. He told the judge that the rats wanted to come, but they were afraid of the neighborhood cats. He argued that it wasn't fair to expect his clients to walk to court when they might get eaten on the way. The judge actually agreed with him and delayed the trial. There was another case where a swarm of locusts was put on trial for eating crops. The judge found them guilty, but realized he couldn't exactly hang 1,000 bugs. Instead, he officially excommunicated them, which basically meant he kicked them out of the church and told them they were going to hell. They did this because they wanted to feel like they had control over a world that felt chaotic. If a pig kills a child, it's a tragedy you can't explain. But if you put that pig in a vest, give it a lawyer, and hang it in the square, you've turned that tragedy into a legal process. You've brought order back to the world. It's strange, it's expensive, and it's a lot of work. But for the people of the Middle Ages, it was the only way to make sense of the madness. They treated animals like people because they were terrified of a world where things happened for no reason. In their minds, if you could put a rat on trial, you could control the plague. If you could hang a pig, you could stop the violence. It was a weird, desperate attempt to keep the world in line. So yeah, hanging a pig might seem like a lot of work just to keep the neighborhood in line. But if you think that was the peak of medieval weirdness, you haven't seen anything yet. You see, the people back then didn't just want order. They wanted a divine stamp of approval on everything they did. They figured that if humans were too dumb or too biased to figure out who was lying, they should just outsource the whole decision to God. It sounds like a bad game show, but the stakes were literally life or death. It was a miserable, terrifying test to see if the big guy upstairs would step in and perform a miracle just for you. Think about how we do things now. If someone accuses you of a crime, you get a lawyer, you look at fingerprints, and you check the security cameras. Back then, they had none of that. If your neighbor said you stole his cow and nobody actually saw you do it, It was just your word against his. That's a total stalemate. So the local priest or the judge would just shrug and say, fine. They truly believed that God wouldn't let an innocent person suffer. He would change the laws of nature right there on the spot to prove you were telling the truth. It sounds wild to us, but to them it was the only way to be 100% sure. This wasn't some symbolic ceremony with a little bit of smoke. It was brutal and very direct. Imagine you're standing inside a cold stone church. There's a massive fire roaring in a metal bin called a brazier. Inside that fire is a solid bar of iron. It's been sitting in the coals until it's literally glowing red. You can see the heat shimmering off it. The priest says a long prayer, asks God to reveal the truth, and then he looks at you. You have to reach out and grab that red-hot bar with your bare hand. You don't just touch it and pull away. You have to pick it up, hold it tight, and walk 3 full paces. That's about 9 or 10 feet. Think about that for a second. Your skin is sizzling. You can probably smell your own hand burning. You want to scream and drop it, but you have to keep walking until you hit that 3rd step. Once you finish those 3 steps, you're allowed to drop the iron. But you're not off the hook yet. They don't give you some ice or some ointment and send you home. Instead, the priest takes some clean linen and wraps your burnt hand up as tight as he can. Then he seals the bandage with wax. You're sent away for 3 days. You just have to sit there in your house, probably in the worst pain of your life, staring at that bandage and wondering what's happening underneath. On the 3rd day, you have to come back to the church. The whole town is usually there watching. The priest breaks the wax seal and slowly unwinds the cloth. This is the big moment. He looks at the wound. If the skin is clean and looks like it's healing up without any rot, you're innocent. God protected you, so you get to go back to your life. But if the wound is festering, if there's pus, or it looks infected and gross, that's it. God has spoken. He let the wound go bad because you were a liar. The punishment for the original crime came next, and usually it was a lot worse than a burnt hand. If you thought the fire was bad, the ordeal by water was a whole different kind of nightmare. This one was based on the idea that water was a holy, pure element. After all, it was used for baptism. So the logic went that water would only accept something that was also pure. If you were a sinner or a criminal, the water would basically act like a magnet with the wrong poles and push you away. It would literally spit you back out. Here is how they actually did it. They'd take you down to a river or a deep pond. They didn't just ask you to jump in and swim. They would tie you up in a very specific, very uncomfortable way. They would take your right thumb and tie it to your left big toe. Then they'd tie your left thumb to your right big toe. You're basically bundled up into a human ball, totally unable to move your arms or legs. Then they'd tie a long rope around your waist. This part is actually the most important part of the whole thing. Once you're tied up, they'd just heave you into the water. Now, think about the physics here. If you splash around and stay on the surface, or if you somehow bob back up, you're guilty. The water rejected you. You're a criminal, and you're probably going to be executed. But if you sink like a stone, congratulations, you're innocent. The water accepted you. But there's a massive problem with being accepted by a pond while your hands and feet are tied together. You're at the bottom of a lake. You can't breathe. You're literally drowning. This is where that rope around your waist comes in. The guys standing on the bank had to be ready. As soon as they saw you sink below the surface, they had to haul you back up as fast as they possibly could. If they were too slow, or if the rope snapped, or if they just weren't paying attention, you'd be the most innocent dead person in the village. You'd be cleared of all charges, sure, but you'd be dead. It was a situation where winning felt a lot like losing. You have to wonder what was going through someone's head when they were standing on the edge of that pond. You're looking at the cold, dark water, and you know that your only hope for survival is nearly drown. It's a complete reversal of every survival instinct we have. Usually, if you fall in water, you want to stay afloat. In this world, floating is a death sentence. And the crazy thing is, people actually believed this worked. They weren't just trying to be mean. They genuinely thought this was the most honest way to run a court. They figured that if God created the world, he could definitely control a little bit of fire or a pond to make sure the right person got punished. It takes a lot of pressure off the judge, doesn't it? You don't have to worry about making a mistake or sending an innocent man to the gallows if you think the creator of the universe is doing the heavy lifting for you. It was a system built on total faith and total terror. They lived in a world where the truth wasn't something you found in a book or a lab.
The truth was something that was written on your skin or at the bottom of a muddy river. It was a world where you prayed for a scar to heal or for your lungs to fill with water because the alternative was much, much worse.
But even if you survived the water or the fire, you weren't exactly home free. See, the medieval mind didn't just rely on miracles and signs from above. They were also pretty good engineers. When they couldn't get the truth out of you by leaving it up to God, they decided to take matters into their own hands. And that's where things get really mechanical. They stopped looking at your soul and started looking at your joints. They moved away from the riverbank and into a dark room with a very specific piece of furniture. You've probably heard of it. It's called the rack. Now, when you hear the word rack, you might think of a spice rack or a coat rack, but this was something else. I want you to imagine a big, heavy wooden frame. It's basically a rectangular bed made of thick oak beams. It sits low to the ground, maybe about waist high. It looks sturdy, like something a carpenter would use to build a house. But instead of a mattress, you've got nothing but open space between the side rails. And at each end of this frame, there's a heavy wooden cylinder. We call these rollers. Think of these rollers like the rolling pin your mom uses for pizza dough, but much bigger and much heavier. Each roller has a handle or a lever stuck into the side of it. These rollers aren't just there to spin freely. They're attached to a mechanism called a ratchet. You know that clicking sound a socket wrench makes when you're tightening a bolt? That's a ratchet. It's designed so the roller can turn in one direction, but it can't spin back. Once you pull it tight, it stays tight. It locks into place with a heavy metallic clack. So, here's how the process actually went down. I want you to put yourself in the shoes of someone they've brought into this room. You're scared, you're tired, and you're looking at this wooden frame. The guys in the room aren't yelling. They're being very professional about it. They tell you to lie down on the wood. They don't just throw you there. They position you carefully. They want you perfectly straight. Then come the ropes. They take thick, rough hemp ropes and loop them around your wrists. They tie these ropes to the roller at the top of the frame near your head. Then they do the same thing to your ankles. They loop the ropes around your feet and tie them to the roller at the bottom. At this point, you're just lying there. The ropes are a little bit loose. You can still move a bit. You can still breathe. But then the man standing at the head of the machine grabs the handle. He gives it one slow turn, just one. You hear that click, click, click of the ratchet. The ropes go from being floppy to being straight lines. You feel a little tug on your shoulders and your hips. It's not painful yet. It feels like a stretch you might do after a long nap. But the guy doesn't stop. He waits for a minute. He asks you a question.
Maybe he wants to know who helped you steal that horse, or who you were talking to at the tavern last Tuesday. You say you don't know anything. He nods to his partner at the other end of the rack. Now they both grab their handles. They turn them at the exact same time. Click, click, click. Now the ropes are pulling hard. Your body is being lifted off the wooden frame slightly because the tension is so high. You're held in mid-air by your wrists and your ankles. Every muscle in your body starts to fight back. You're trying to pull your arms back in toward your chest, but you're fighting against a machine made of oak and iron. You can't win that fight. Your muscles start to get tired. They can't hold the tension anymore. And that's when the real damage starts to happen. You see, your body is held together by things called ligaments and tendons. Think of them like really strong rubber bands that keep your bones tucked into their sockets. Your shoulder is a ball and socket joint. It's meant to move around, but it's not meant to be pulled out of its house. As the torturer turns the handle again, the tension goes beyond what those rubber bands can handle. You'll hear a sound. It's a wet, muffled pop. That's your shoulder slipping out of the hole it's supposed to live in. Then it happens to the other side. Pop. Now your arms are longer than they were 5 minutes ago. Your hips are next. The ball of your hip bone gets dragged right out of the pelvic socket. This isn't like a quick break. It's a slow, steady pulling apart of everything that makes you a person. The pain is something I can't even describe. It's not a sharp poke or a burn. It's an overwhelming feeling of your body being undone. Your muscles start to tear, not all at once, but fiber by fiber. It's like the sound of an old piece of denim being ripped apart, but it's happening inside your chest and your legs. And the whole time, the guy with the handle is just standing there. He isn't angry. He's just waiting for you to say a name. That's the thing you have to understand about the rack. The goal wasn't usually to kill you. If they wanted you dead, they had much faster ways to do that. They could just use an axe or a rope. The rack was an information-gathering tool. It was a way to make the truth, or whatever version of the truth they wanted, come out of your mouth. They wanted you to talk. They wanted a list of your friends. They wanted you to sign a piece of paper. As long as you kept your mouth shut, they kept turning the handle. They might leave you there for hours, stretched out like a piece of string on a guitar. Every time you think you've gotten used to the pain, they give the roller one more notch. Click. The tension goes up. The tearing gets worse. Eventually, almost everyone talked. You'd say anything. You'd admit to being the king of France if it meant they'd just let the tension off those ropes. Once you gave them what they wanted, the torture stopped. They'd release the ratchets, the rollers would spin back, and your body would finally hit the wooden frame again. But here is the part that people forget in the movies. Just because the torture is over doesn't mean you're okay. Your body doesn't just snap back like a rubber band. When you pull a joint out of its socket that far, you're stretching the nerves. You're tearing the tissues that are supposed to hold you together. Most people who spent a serious amount of time on the rack were never the same again. They were crippled for life. Their arms would just hang at their sides, useless. They couldn't walk because their hips were ruined. They might have gotten their life back, but they couldn't actually use it. They were walking, breathing reminders of what happened when you didn't have the right answers. They were stretched out, physically and mentally, until there was nothing left but a shell of the person who walked into that room. And all of this was done with a few pieces of wood and a simple handle. It was clean, it was quiet,
and it was absolutely devastating.
Now, you might think that once you're dead, the punishment stops. I mean, usually that's how the deal works. You die, you're gone, and the law pretty much loses its grip on you. But in the Middle Ages, they had a very different way of looking at things. They believed that even if you were buried 6 feet under, you still weren't safe if you'd made the wrong people angry. And in the year 897, we see the weirdest example of this in human history. It involves 2 popes, a crowded courtroom, and a guy who had been dead and buried for 7 months. To understand how things got this crazy, you have to meet Pope Formosus. He was the guy in charge until he died in 896. By all accounts, he did his job, he lived his life, and then he passed away like anyone else. He was buried in a nice tomb, and that should have been the end of the story. But the guy who came after him, Pope Stephen VI, absolutely hated his guts. I'm not talking about a little disagreement over dinner or a professional rivalry. I'm talking about the kind of deep, burning hate that doesn't go away just because a person isn't breathing anymore. Stephen felt that Formosus was a fake. He believed that Formosus had broken church laws to become pope, and that every single thing he did while he was in power was a lie. Stephen didn't just want to move on. He wanted to cancel Formosus from history. He wanted to make it like the guy never existed. But to do that officially, he needed a trial. He couldn't just say it, he had to prove it in court. The only problem was that the defendant was already a corpse. Most people would see that as a deal breaker. Not Stephen. He decided that if the defendant couldn't walk into court on his own, he'd just have to be carried in. So Stephen did something that sounds like it's straight out of a horror movie. He ordered his guards to go to the grave of the former pope. He told them to get their shovels, head over to the tomb, and dig him up. Now, keep in mind, Formosus had been in the ground for 7 months. If you know anything about how bodies work, you know he wasn't looking his best. He was a rotting corpse in the middle of a very messy process. But Stephen didn't care about the smell or the rot. He had the guards haul the body out of the dirt and bring it into the Vatican. This is where it gets truly bizarre. Stephen didn't just want to look at the body to make sure he was really dead. He wanted to put it on trial right then and there. This event is known in history as the Cadaver Synod. A synod is basically just a big meeting of church leaders, but this one had a dead guy as the guest of honor. Stephen had the guards dress the corpse back up in his official pope clothes. They pulled the fancy silk robes over the rotting skin. They put the papal hat on his head. They did the whole works. Then they took this man and propped him up on a throne in the middle of the courtroom. Imagine being one of the bishops sitting in that room. You've got all these high-ranking officials in their best clothes, and right there in the center is a guy who's been dead for half a year, sitting on a chair like he's just waiting for the meeting to start. The smell must have been unbearable. People were probably gagging into their sleeves, but Stephen was so intense that nobody dared to leave. The trial started, and Stephen was the one yelling the questions. He didn't just talk, he screamed. He stood right in front of the corpse and shouted his accusations. He asked Formosus why he was so ambitious. He asked why he took a job he wasn't allowed to have. He treated the body like it could actually hear him. But obviously, Formosus couldn't talk back. A corpse doesn't have much to say for itself. To fix this little problem of the defendant being silent, Stephen had hired a young guy, a deacon, to stand behind the throne. This kid's entire job for the day was to pretend to be the dead pope's voice. Every time Stephen yelled a question at the body, the deacon would hide behind the chair and squeak out an answer. He had to try and defend the guy who was literally falling apart right in front of him. It was a total circus. You have a living pope screaming at a dead one and a terrified teenager acting like a ventriloquist for a ghost. Stephen went on, listing every mistake he thought Formosus had ever made. He worked himself into a total rage. He was pointing his finger, stomping around, and acting like this was a fair fight. The rest of the people in the room just watched in silence. They were probably wondering if Stephen had finally lost his mind. But at the time, the Pope had a lot of power. If he wanted to yell at a dead body, you let him yell at a dead body. It didn't take long for the court to reach a verdict. I mean, the judge was the one bringing the charges, so the outcome was pretty much decided before they even started digging. They found Formosus guilty of everything. Stephen was thrilled. He finally had the legal excuse he needed to wipe Formosus out of the records. First, the court declared that every single thing Formosus had done as pope was now illegal. Every person he had promoted was fired. Every law he had signed was torn up. But Stephen wasn't satisfied with just changing some paperwork. He wanted a physical punishment to go along with the legal one. He ordered the guards to take the body and chop off the 3 fingers on its right hand. Now, there was a specific reason for this. In the church, those are the 3 fingers a pope uses when he gives a blessing to the crowds. By cutting them off, Stephen was sending a message. He was saying that Formosus never had the right to bless anyone. He was taking away the very tools the man used to do his job. It was a way of saying that even in the afterlife, your hands are no good here. After the fingers were gone, they still weren't finished. They didn't put him back in his grave. Instead, they stripped the fancy robes off the body until he was down to nothing. They dragged him out of the courtroom and through the streets of Rome. Think about that for a second. This was a man who had been the leader of their entire world just a year earlier. Now he was being pulled through the dirt like a piece of trash. People came out of their houses to watch. They saw the former pope being humiliated in the most public way possible. Finally, they took what was left of him and threw him into the Tiber River. They didn't want a grave for people to visit. They didn't want any memory of him left on land. They wanted him to just float away and be forgotten forever. They wanted to show that the power of the law and the power of a grudge could follow you all the way to the grave and beyond. But here's the kicker. The people of Rome actually liked Formosus. When they saw what Stephen had done, the digging up, the screaming, the finger chopping, they didn't think it was justice. They thought it was disgusting. They started to think that maybe Stephen was the one who shouldn't be in charge. Not long after the trial, a rumor started that Formosus's body had washed up on the shore and started performing miracles. The public got so angry that they eventually turned on Stephen. They broke into his palace, stripped him of his power, and threw him in prison. He ended up getting strangled in his cell just a few months later. So, in the end, the guy who tried to punish a dead man ended up meeting a pretty dark end himself. The whole story of the Cadaver Synod shows just how far people were willing to go back then. It wasn't enough to beat your enemy while they were alive. You had to beat them after they were dead, too. It shows that in the Middle Ages, punishment wasn't just about pain or prison. It was about your reputation, your legacy, and your soul. They believed that the law didn't stop at the cemetery gate. If they felt you deserved to suffer, they would find a way to make it happen, even if they had to bring a shovel to do it. It's one of the weirdest chapters in history, and it proves that sometimes the most brutal punishments didn't even require the victim to be awake for them.
Since we were just talking about people being dug up just to be punished, you'd think that was the peak of medieval weirdness. But honestly, it gets way worse when the person is still breathing. If I had to pick the one thing from history that really makes my stomach turn, it's the breaking wheel. Some people call it the Catherine wheel. Whatever you call it, it was basically the gold standard for being as mean as possible to another human being. I want you to imagine a busy town square. It's a normal Tuesday. People are out buying bread and talking about the weather. Then the executioner shows up. He isn't carrying a sword or a rope. He's just rolling a large wooden wagon wheel. It's the kind of wheel you'd see on a heavy farm cart. It's thick, it's made of solid oak, and it's got a heavy iron rim around the outside to keep the wood from splitting. It's heavy. If you tried to lift it yourself, you'd probably throw your back out. So here's how this goes down. They don't start with the wheel on a cart. They start with you on the ground. The executioner and his helpers grab the person and pin them flat on the dirt. They pull their arms and legs out wide, almost like they're making a human X. They don't just leave them there, though. They take some thick pieces of wood and put them under your wrists, your elbows, your knees, and your ankles. This is important because it creates a gap. It's like putting a piece of wood under a twig so it's easier to snap it in half. Now everyone is watching. The executioner picks up that heavy wagon wheel. He isn't going to roll it. He's going to use it like a giant circular hammer. He lifts it high over his head. You can imagine how much strength that takes. He takes aim and lets it drop. He's not aiming for your head. That would be too fast. He's aiming for the spots between your joints. The wheel comes down with all that weight and that iron rim. It hits the shin bone first. You hear a sound like a dry branch snapping in the woods, but much louder. Then he lifts it again. He moves to the other leg. Drop. Snap. He moves to the thighs. Drop. Snap. He works his way up to the arms. He hits the forearms and then the upper arms. By the time he's done, the limbs aren't really limbs anymore. They're just bags of skin filled with broken pieces of bone. Every major bone in their arms and legs is shattered into small chunks. But here is the really crazy part. The executioner is a pro. He knows exactly where to hit so that he doesn't kill the person. He avoids the chest. He avoids the head. He wants the heart to keep beating. He wants the person to stay awake for the next part. Once the bones are all broken, the executioner isn't finished with the wheel. Now he uses it for its original purpose, but in a really twisted way. He takes the broken arms and legs, which are now soft and floppy because there's no solid bone left to hold them straight, and he starts weaving them. He treats the person like they are a piece of yarn or a long vine. He pulls an arm through the wooden spokes of the wheel. He loops it over one spoke and under the next. Then he does the same thing with the legs. Think about that for a second. He's literally braiding a human being into a wagon wheel. Because the bones are broken into so many pieces, the limbs can bend in ways they were never meant to. He can pull the feet up toward the head. He can wrap the arms around the rim. When he's done, the person is basically part of the wheel. They are stuck there, tangled up in the wood. Now, you'd think that's the end of it. You'd think they'd just leave the wheel on the ground. But they wanted everyone to see what happens when you break the law. So they take a long wooden pole, maybe 10 or 15 feet high. They stick the pole deep into the dirt so it stands up straight. Then they take the wheel, with the person still woven into it, and they lift the whole thing up. They mount the wheel flat on top of the pole, like a giant grizzly umbrella. Now the person is way up in the air. They are facing the sky. They can't move. They can't even wiggle, and they are still alive. This is where the real waiting game starts. Since they are high up, they are the first thing the birds notice. Crows and vultures start to circle. They don't wait for the person to die. They start landing on the wheel. They start picking at the person while they are still breathing. And it's not just the birds. It's the sun. It's the thirst. Imagine being stuck on top of a pole in the middle of a hot summer day. You've got broken bones everywhere. You're bleeding, and you haven't had a drop of water. The sun beats down on you all day long. Your skin starts to burn. Then the night comes, and it gets freezing cold. The wildest thing about the breaking wheel is how long it took. This wasn't a 10-minute execution. People could stay alive on top of those poles for 2, 3, or even 4 days. They'd be up there talking, screaming, or just moaning while the town went about its business down below. Sometimes people would even walk by and try to toss them a drink of water, but the guards usually wouldn't let them. The executioner would just watch. If he was feeling nice, he might eventually hit the person in the chest with the wheel to end it. They called that the blow of mercy. That meant the person had to stay up there until their body just gave out on its own. By the time it was over, there wasn't much left. The birds would have done their work. The sun would have dried everything out. Eventually, the body would just rot and fall off the wheel, piece by piece. They wouldn't even give the person a funeral. They'd just leave the remains there on the ground as a warning to anyone else thinking about committing a crime. It's hard to wrap your head around how someone could come up with this. It wasn't just about killing someone. It was about turning a human being into a piece of furniture and letting nature slowly take them apart. It makes a simple hanging look like a vacation. When you think about the medieval times, you think about knights and castles, but the reality was a lot more like this. It was a world where a simple wagon wheel could be the most terrifying thing you ever saw.
I don't know about you, but I can't look at an old cartwheel the same way after learning that. It's one thing to be cruel, but it's another thing to be this creative about it. They took a tool used for travel and turned it into a nightmare on a stick. It really shows you that back then, they didn't just want you dead. They wanted you to be a landmark. They wanted you to be a lesson that lasted for days on end, hanging up there against the sky until there was nothing left but the wood and the iron.
But eventually, the crowd stopped cheering. You can only watch someone get pulled apart so many times before you start asking a very dangerous question. Does any of this actually work? For hundreds of years, the people in charge thought that if they made the punishment scary enough, nobody would break the rules. They thought they could scare the sin right out of you. But they noticed a problem. The crime didn't stop. And even worse, the justice they were handing out was often a lie. Think about it. If I'm holding a red-hot iron to your skin and asking where you hid the gold, you're going to give me an answer. You'll give me any answer. You'll tell me you hid it in the king's basement. You'll tell me your neighbor helped you. You'll say you did things you never even dreamed of doing. You'll say whatever it takes to make me put the iron down. The people in charge finally realized they weren't getting the truth.
They were just getting noise. They were killing innocent people because those people were too tired of the pain to keep lying. This realization started a massive shift in how we think. It's what we call the Enlightenment. Now, that sounds like a big fancy word, but it really just means people started using their heads. They looked at the bloody mess of the Middle Ages and decided it was a failure. It was messy, it was expensive, and it didn't make the streets any safer. They decided to stop trying to break the human body and started trying to fix the human mind. They didn't call it that yet, but that was the goal. They wanted to change you. So they came up with a new plan. Instead of punishing your skin, they decided to punish your time. Think about that for a second. Your body can heal. You can get over a scar, but you can never, ever get back a Tuesday. You can't get back 10 years of your life. They realized that taking away someone's freedom was actually way more powerful than taking away their fingernails. This is when we see the birth of the actual prison. Before this, a jail was just a place you stayed for a few days while you waited for the executioner to show up. It was a holding pen. But now, the jail became the punishment itself. They started building these massive stone buildings called penitentiaries. The word comes from penitence, which is just a way of saying you feel sorry for what you did. These places weren't built for torture. They were built for silence. The idea was pretty simple, but also kind of psychological. They put you in a small, cramped cell. No friends, no family, no talking. Just you, a Bible, and 4 stone walls. They thought that if you sat in the dark long enough, with nothing but your own thoughts, your conscience would eventually catch up to you. They thought the guilt would hurt more than a whip ever could. They wanted you to sit there and replay your crimes over and over in your head until you genuinely wanted to be a better person. It was a total flip in how the world worked. We went from public shows of gore to private rooms of silence. We stopped making landmarks out of dead bodies and started making warehouses for the living. It was the end of the Middle Ages and the start of the world we live in now. We traded the axe for the clock.
So, the clock won. We stopped lopping off heads in the street and started locking people in rooms for years at a time. It feels more civilized, doesn't it? It's cleaner. But the weird part is, we never actually got rid of the ideas behind those old punishments. We just gave them a makeover. Take the pillory, for example. You know the one. That wooden frame where you'd stand for hours while people threw rotten fruit and mud at your face. It was meant to make you a joke. It was meant to ruin your reputation so you could never show your face in town again without someone laughing. We don't do that in the middle of the village square anymore, but honestly, look at your phone. Social media is just a 24-hour digital town square. When someone screws up today, we don't put them in wooden stocks. We make them trend. We dig up their old photos and share them with 1 million people. We let thousands of strangers scream at them from their living rooms. It's the exact same impulse. It's that basic human urge to point a finger and say that you aren't one of us. We still want the public shame. We just swap the actual tomatoes for mean comments. It's less messy for the city workers, sure, but the sting is exactly the same. We traded the physical pain for psychological pressure. It's a bit dark when you really think about it. Humans have always been incredibly creative when it comes to being mean. Give us a piece of rope, a metal mask, or even a heavy rock, and we'll find a way to turn it into a nightmare. We've spent hundreds of years coming up with these bizarre, complicated ways to make people feel small. Take those metal masks they used for people who talk too much. They didn't just lock your jaw shut. They often put a little bell on top so everyone would hear you coming. You couldn't hide. Or look at the way they used water. They'd tie a person up and dunk them into a freezing river over and over until they nearly drowned, all while the neighbors cheered from the bank. It wasn't just about the cold. It was about the audience. Our ancestors didn't just want you to hurt. They wanted you to look ridiculous while it happened. They wanted the whole world to watch you fail. But hey, we have made some progress. I mean, we finally stopped bringing farm animals to court. I still can't get over that part of history. Can you imagine a lawyer today trying to cross-examine a goat? Or a judge sentencing a pig to the gallows because it broke through a fence and ate the neighbor's garden? We finally realized that a cow doesn't have a moral compass. That's a win for common sense. It took us a few hundred years, but we got there. We decided to keep the law for people and keep the animals in the barn. That's one less thing for the court reporters to worry about. When you look back at all these stories, it's easy to feel like we're totally different people now. We have rights, we have trials, and we have air-conditioned jails. But the core of it hasn't changed all that much. We still get angry, we still want people to pay for what they did, and we still love a good public spectacle. The tools we use just look a lot more like keyboards than axes these days. We're still the same weird, creative, and sometimes cruel humans we've always been. We just have better plumbing and fewer public executions. Thanks for sticking with me through all of this. It was a weird trip through some of the darkest corners of the past. I'm glad we can talk about these things without worrying about ending up in a cage ourselves. I really appreciate you watching. I'll see you around.